Some storms don't start with thunder, they begin in silence. Arnold Schwarzenegger hadn't planned to stop in New Mexico that night. Just a quiet roadside diner, a hot cup of tea, and a few more miles to go. But fate doesn't ask permission. And when 5 men walked through that door with bad intentions, they didn't know who was already sitting in the corner, watching, waiting, and carrying a lifetime of battles behind those quiet eyes. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. Rain hammered the empty highway outside Albuquerque, New Mexico. The kind of rain that made the desert feel like it was washing something off its skin. Lightning crackled somewhere far, just enough to flash against the wet asphalt. The neon sign of the desert moon diner buzzed and flickered, fighting to stay alive against the storm. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, eggs, and weary hope. It was past midnight. The booths were mostly empty. A trucker slept face down on the counter, arms folded around an untouched slice of pie. In the far corner, an older couple sat in silence, sharing toast, and not much else. The jukebox whispered something slow and bluesy, barely audible over the hum of the overhead lights. Behind the counter, Camila Brown moved like someone used to moving, wiping down a surface that had already been wiped twice, checking the coffee burner even though it wasn't close to empty. Her eyes, though, they kept drifting toward the door. Camila was in her early 30s, black, with tired eyes and a kind face that hadn't had a reason to smile in weeks. Her uniform was neat but worn, apron tied a little too tight around her waist. She didn't know why the tension sat in her shoulders tonight. Maybe it was the rain, maybe it was the time of month, or maybe it was something else. The bell above the door jingled, not loud, just enough to cut through the low rumble of the storm. Every head in the diner turned. A tall man stepped in from the rain, broad shoulders under a faded army green jacket, jeans soaked from the knees down, boots that had seen too many miles. He moved with quiet weight, like someone who didn't rush because he didn't need to. A few droplets fell from the brim of his hat as he paused just inside. His face was half-shadowed, but what showed was a mix of steel and age. Ridges around the eyes, gray stubble along a square jaw. He had the kind of presence that didn't ask permission to be noticed. He walked to the counter, sat at the far end without a word, didn't shake off the rain. Just rested his hands on the formica like he was grounding himself. Camila approached cautiously, not because he looked dangerous, but because he looked still. "What can I get you?" she asked. His voice was quiet, low and rough like stones scraped against wood. "Hot mint tea with honey." She blinked. Not coffee, not a burger, tea. She nodded, turned away, and only then realized she'd been holding her breath. She made the tea, placed it in front of him, and he offered a single word, "Thanks." He didn't look up, just wrapped both hands around the cup and sat there, eyes unfocused, like he was watching something far off. He didn't pull out a phone, didn't ask for a menu, didn't look at anyone else in the room. Camila stepped back, but her gaze lingered. There was something in the way he sat, back straight but not rigid, boots planted, breathing even. He didn't fidget, he didn't blink much, just waited. She didn't know for what, but the air changed after he walked in, like the room had shifted a few degrees colder, or quieter. The rain outside didn't let up. Thunder groaned again in the distance, and the jukebox stuttered, skipping half a beat before picking up again. The man sipped his tea, still not looking at anyone. Camila returned to wiping counters that didn't need wiping. And somewhere, just under the hum of neon and storm, something waited. The rain didn't ease up. It came harder now, slamming against the diner windows in waves. Wind howled across the empty highway, rattling the glass like a warning no one heard. Inside, the desert moon held its breath. The low jazz spilling from the jukebox had a scratch to it, like the record was too tired to keep playing. Camila wiped the same spot on the counter for the third time. The man at the end of the bar hadn't moved. Still sipping his tea, still silent. Still that sense, like the room leaned toward him without knowing why. Then the door didn't chime, it slammed. The bell above it screamed against the wind as it swung wide open. 5 men stepped in like they owned the air, boots wet and heavy, leather jackets soaked and glistening. The first one through walked with a swagger sharpened by scars and smoke. His name was Hawk Doyle, but folks didn't say it unless they had to. Deep scar across his jaw, silver chain resting on a barrel chest, eyes that never smiled. He looked around the diner like a wolf sniffing out weakness. Camila froze, her knuckles went white on the rag. Behind her calm face, something locked into place. Hawk grinned wide and mean. Well, well, he drawled, voice full of oil and glass. Still open for business, huh? Nobody answered. The trucker woke up, sat straighter. The elderly couple looked down at their toast like maybe if they stared hard enough, they could disappear. Arnold didn't lift his head, didn't blink, just sat there breathing slow. Camila stood tall, her voice didn't shake. You need to leave, Hawk. We're not doing this tonight. Hawk laughed, a sound too loud for the small space. See, that's the problem, sweetheart. You still think you get a choice. He walked toward the counter. His crew spread out behind him, flanking tables, brushing shoulders too close to strangers. One grabbed a spoon off the counter, twirled it like a knife. Another eyed the jukebox with something cruel behind his grin. Hawk slammed a hand on the counter, silverware jumped, coffee rippled in mugs. Camila didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. We talked about this, she said. Last week, you're not getting a dime. Protection don't pay itself, Hawk said, leaning in. His breath smelled like beer and old smoke. Accidents happen, windows break, people get hurt. It's a real shame when things like that happen to nice little places like this. One of the bikers snorted. Another knocked over a napkin holder, let it clatter to the floor. A third reached over and snatched a sugar dispenser, hurling it across the room. It shattered against the jukebox. The music died in a gasp of static. The silence afterward was louder than the crash. Camila didn't blink. She took half a step back. Her hand, beneath the counter, found a small black button. She pressed it. No sound, no signal. Just the whisper of tension turning sharp. Hawk raised an eyebrow. You think you're in charge? He jerked his chin. One of his crew, a tall, narrow man with yellow teeth, moved behind the counter. Too close. He walked right up to Camila, forcing her back against the shelves. Maybe we need to remind you who runs this stretch of road, he hissed. In the corner, Arnold sipped his tea, still silent, still calm, but his eyes flicked up. Just once, the man reached for Camila's arm. That's when something shifted. Not the air, not the room, something deeper. The storm outside roared. Inside, time slowed. The man's hand closed around Camila's wrist. She didn't cry out, but her eyes darted toward the quiet figure at the end of the counter. And for a second, just a second, she wondered if he'd move, if anyone would. The button under the counter had been pressed. Help was coming, but not fast enough. And not soon enough to stop what was about to happen. The biker's hand tightened on Camila's wrist. His grip was rough, meant to intimidate, to remind her where she stood. But she didn't back down. Her breath caught in her chest, not from fear, but from waiting. The diner seemed to pause. The jukebox was dead. The only sound left was the soft thunder beyond the windows and the subtle scrape of a chair sliding back. It was slow, not sudden, not dramatic, just a shift, like something heavy waking up. Arnold stood. Not with anger, not with a shout. He just rose to his full height, tall, wide, and unhurried. The room noticed. Every head turned. Even the biker holding Camila froze for half a beat, like his senses had caught up and told him something was wrong. Arnold didn't speak. He walked forward, deliberate steps, boots silent on the tiled floor. His jacket hung heavy, soaked at the bottom, and the scar above his brow caught a glint of neon. One hand reached out, not fast, not flashy, and wrapped around the biker's forearm, not just held it, owned it. The biker tried to jerk away but couldn't. Arnold's hand tightened like a steel vise, a twist, a shift in weight. And the man was on the ground. No cry, just a hard, painful thud, wrist bent backward, body folded into itself, face pressed against the linoleum. The trucker gasped. The elderly couple ducked. Camila stepped back, her heart pounding, not from panic but from awe. Arnold stood between her and the rest of them now, not posturing, just present. Hawk blinked. You serious, old man? Arnold's eyes didn't waver. They held no threat, only certainty. Let her go, he said quietly, and walk out. The biker on the floor groaned. His fingers twitched but didn't close. Hawk looked around, confused for the first time in years. One of his men, a younger guy with a chain around his neck, lunged forward, swinging a fist wide. Arnold didn't flinch. He stepped into the punch, caught the wrist midair, pulled the attacker's momentum forward, and drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The biker flew back into a booth. Wood cracked, plates clattered. He didn't get back up. Another charged from the side with a growl, going low like a linebacker. Arnold shifted his stance, let the momentum carry the attacker past him, then hooked the man's arm and sent him tumbling over his hip. The biker landed hard on the floor, gasping, coughing, trying to remember which way was up. Hawk's lips curled. "Get him," he barked. Two more came at once, one with a knife, one with fists. Arnold's eyes sharpened, not afraid, not angry, just aware. The one with the knife slashed forward. Arnold stepped aside, caught the wrist, and twisted. The blade clattered to the ground. He shoved the man back with a palm to the chest. The other swung wild. Arnold ducked, then rose with a short, sharp elbow to the chin. The man dropped, unconscious before he hit the floor. It wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling, precise, controlled, no wasted motion, no chaos. Just force applied exactly where it needed to be. Hawk was the last one standing. His jaw was tight. He reached into his coat and pulled out a brass knuckle, sliding it over his fingers. "You've got moves, old man," he snarled. "Let's see how you take a real hit." He charged, fast, reckless. Arnold sidestepped, blocked the first jab with his forearm, then hooked Hawk's arm and twisted it back. With one clean step, he brought the man to his knees. A sharp elbow drove between Hawk's shoulders. The brass knuckle clattered to the ground. Hawk tried to rise again, fury in his eyes, but Arnold caught his arm, pivoted, and threw him clean across the floor. Hawk slid into a table and stayed down. The diner fell silent. Every breath was held, every eye locked on the man in the soaked jacket who hadn't even broken a sweat. Arnold exhaled once, slow. Camila stared at him. Her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" He didn't answer, just stood there, surrounded by groaning bodies and shattered ceramic, like a monument left behind after a storm. And in the stillness, the truth became clear. He wasn't a man who liked fighting. He was a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding it until there was no other choice. Red and blue lights pulsed through the rain-streaked windows, casting the diner in flickering waves of color. Outside, tires screeched, doors slammed. The storm hadn't stopped, but now it shared the stage. The front door burst open, and two officers stepped in, guns raised, eyes wide. They froze for half a second, scanning the wreckage. 5 grown men lay sprawled across the floor, groaning, coughing, not one of them still fighting. Tables overturned. Broken glass glittered like ice on the linoleum, and in the center stood one man, tall, still, calm, hands lowered, no weapon, just presence. The older officer lowered his gun first. What the hell happened here? Camila stepped out from behind the counter. Her voice was hoarse. They came in swinging. He stopped them. She nodded toward Arnold. The younger cop moved to the biker with the chain around his neck, began zip-tying his wrists. "This one's breathing, barely." His partner looked over at Hawk, who was sitting up now, clutching his shoulder, blood dripping from his lip. "That him?" The younger cop checked his phone, pulled up a photo. Then he squinted, compared it. "That's him, Arnold Doyle, a.k.a. Hawk. We've had a file on this guy for months." Camila's eyes narrowed. "Arnold Doyle," the officer nodded. "Leader of a protection racket out of Valencia County. We've been tracking his crew. Break-ins, threats, extortion, never had enough to stick." Hawk spat blood to the side. "You think this ends with me?" His voice was ragged, but his grin still held venom. "You think I came alone, little girl?" Camila didn't flinch. Arnold took a step forward, just one, and Hawk's mouth shut like someone had flipped a switch. The officer turned toward Arnold. "Name?" Arnold didn't speak right away. He looked around the diner, looked at Camila, at the broken plates, at the quiet that had settled over everything like dust after a blast. Then finally he said, "I don't need a name." The older officer blinked. "You want to file a statement?" Arnold nodded toward the tracker, still frozen in his seat, phone in hand. "He's got it all, from the moment they walked in." The cop raised an eyebrow. "You recorded this?" The tracker nodded fast. "All of it. I didn't stop once." "Good, we'll need that." Camila stepped closer to the officer. "I want to press charges." He looked her in the eye. We'll support that. We'll keep a car nearby for a while, but you need to know people like Doyle don't work alone. There are others, maybe worse. Camila glanced at Arnold. He said nothing, just kept his gaze on the wreckage like he was already calculating the next storm. As the officers began hauling the bikers to their feet, one by one, Hawk locked eyes with Camila again. "You've made yourself a problem," he muttered. "We'll see how long you last." But this time, his voice lacked bite, like even he knew the power had shifted. As they dragged him through the door, rain poured down in sheets. Camila stood near the counter, arms crossed, chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. She didn't say thank you, she didn't have to. Arnold hadn't moved, hadn't sat back down. Just waited, quiet and composed, in the ruins of a place he didn't plan to be. The storm outside was still loud, but the one inside had passed. Almost. Somewhere, in a server across the country, a video file had already started uploading. And by morning, the world would know what happened in the Desert Moon Diner. The rain had slowed to a steady whisper against the windows, like the storm was finally tired. Inside, the Desert Moon looked like the aftermath of something too big for words. Broken chairs, shattered plates, overturned tables. Coffee stains streaked the linoleum like bruises. The jukebox was dark and crooked, wires exposed. The lights still buzzed overhead, but everything underneath them felt quieter. Camila stood behind the counter, towel in one hand, the other gripping the edge for balance. Her breath came in uneven waves. The adrenaline had left her body, and in its place was something heavier. Exhaustion, maybe sorrow. Arnold picked up a chair and set it upright. Then another. No sound but the soft scrape of wood against tile. He didn't speak, just moved slow, careful, like he respected the damage. Camila watched him for a moment. Then she stepped out and began sweeping glass into a dustpan. Her hands shook a little, but she didn't stop. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of something unspoken. Finally, she said, "My parents used to own this place." Her voice was low, like she wasn't sure she wanted to hear it out loud. "I did my homework in that booth, right there." She nodded toward the corner, where a bench was still smeared with blood. "They passed 3 years ago. I kept the diner going because, I don't know, felt like letting it die would be letting them go too." Arnold said nothing. He just stacked another chair. Camila looked down at the broom in her hands. The first time Hawk came in, he didn't touch anything, just talked, just smiled that slimy smile. "I knew it was bad, I knew what he was, but I thought maybe, if I stayed quiet, if I didn't push, he'd leave me alone." She swallowed. He didn't. The dustpan clattered into the trash. She leaned on the counter, eyes closed. "Every time I didn't say anything, every time I gave him free coffee or let him hang around, I thought I was keeping the peace. I thought I was being smart, but I was just scared." Arnold stopped moving, turned to face her. "Everyone's scared," he said. "That's not weakness." She met his eyes. There was no judgment in his face, just weight. Like a man who'd seen fear wear 100 different masks. "Then what is weakness?" she asked. "Letting fear make the decision for you." Camila let that sit. The jukebox crackled once, then fell silent again. Rain tapped gently on the roof. She wiped her hands on her apron, even though they weren't wet. "You didn't have to help," she said. Arnold looked at the mess, the silence, the blood. "Didn't plan to," he said, "but some lines don't go uncrossed." Camila looked around the diner. "It's a wreck." Arnold nodded, "but not ruined." She knelt to pick up a broken mug. The pieces didn't fit right anymore, but she gathered them anyway. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "Not them," he said, "but someone will." She nodded slowly, no fear in her face now, just something deeper, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. She looked at the cracked tile, the stained walls, the chair she'd sat in as a little girl. And she knew something no one had said aloud yet. She hadn't survived tonight because of the man who stepped in. She de-survived because when it mattered, she hadn't stepped back. The sky was turning pale, not sunrise yet, but close. That in-between hour when everything felt softer, like the world wasn't sure it wanted to wake up. Rain had stopped. Puddles shimmered on the asphalt outside. Inside the diner, the mess had been mostly cleared, chairs back in place, counters wiped, but the air still held the echo of what had happened. Camila moved slower now, not from fear, from weight, from the kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones. The bell over the door jingled softly. Two officers stepped in, hats damp, jackets heavy with morning moisture. Sergeant Garcia this time, older, slower, with tired eyes that had seen more than they liked. He walked to the counter and removed his cap. "We've got Doyle in holding, his crew's booked. Assault, extortion, attempted robbery. The video helped." Camila nodded. "Good." Garcia paused. His fingers tapped the counter gently. "But he wasn't wrong about having people outside. He's not the top of the ladder, just one rung. There's a web up north. Valencia County, Santa Fe. If they find out what happened here, they might send someone to finish the message." Camila's throat tightened. "So what do I do?" Garcia shrugged. "Keep your head down. We'll have patrol cars pass through for a while." It didn't sound like protection. It sounded like procedure, like routine dressed up as reassurance. Garcia glanced toward the booth where Arnold sat, silent, drinking tea that had long gone cold. "You got a bodyguard now?" Camila followed his gaze. "No, he just happened to be here." The sergeant nodded. "Funny how fate works." Then he left, door swinging shut behind him, leaving nothing but the soft hum of lights and the clink of a spoon in a teacup. Camila walked over, sat across from Arnold, her fingers interlaced tightly on the table. "They'll come back," she said. He didn't argue, just looked at her, steady. "Maybe not them, but someone will." She leaned forward. "So you staying?" A long pause, not heavy, just real. "No." Her breath caught just a little. "Why not?" Arnold set down his cup. "Because this isn't about me. I'm a guest, passing through this place, this fight, it's yours." She looked away, out the window. "I don't want to fight, I just want peace." "Peace doesn't happen by waiting," he said. "It happens when you stop letting fear choose for you." Her jaw clenched. "I don't know if I'm ready." He nodded slowly. "Neither did I first time I saw real war. I was 9, bombs, screams, everything I knew crumbling. I ran. For years I ran, then one day I didn't. Not because I was stronger, but because I was tired of running." She looked at him now, really looked, and he held her gaze, and that's when I started living. Silence settled between them again. But not the same silence as before. This one carried weight. Camila sat back. "So what? I fight every time someone walks through that door?" "No," he said. "You make it so they don't want to walk through that door again." She laughed once, dry and tired. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," he said, "but it's necessary." A moment passed, then another. Camila nodded, not because she understood everything, but because something inside her finally agreed. The jukebox sparked once in the corner, as if trying to find its voice again. She looked at him. "Thank you." He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. "Don't thank me, just don't forget." And for the first time since the storm broke, the diner felt like it might breathe again. By mid-morning, the clouds had begun to break. Pale sunlight filtered through the smeared windows, casting thin golden stripes across the floor. The desert moon still looked bruised. One window was taped over, a booth in the back was roped off, and the jukebox sparked when it tried to start, but the space felt different. Not whole, not yet, but alive. Customers started trickling in, not many at first. A woman in a knit hat who always ordered chamomile tea, the man from the gas station across the highway who left exact change and never spoke. Then more, a young couple with tired eyes, a delivery guy who usually just passed by. They all came in quiet, sat quiet, glanced around the room as if expecting to see ghosts. What they saw instead was Camila behind the counter, towel over one shoulder, apron tied tight, moving with a purpose that hadn't been there the day before. And Arnold, still at the same booth, still sipping tea, still not saying much. His presence didn't pull attention, it anchored it. A man walked in alone, late 30s, nervous hands, quick eyes. He approached the counter slowly. "You're Camila, right?" She nodded, cautious. "You don't know me," he said, voice low. "But I saw the video. I used to run a little food truck outside Valencia. Doyle's guys hit me last year, broke my windows, said they'd come back if I didn't pay." He hesitated. "I didn't say anything, was too scared. But after what you did, I called the cops, filed a report for the first time." Camila stared at him, the weight of his words settled slowly. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "No, thank you." He turned and left before she could say more. The bell above the door jingled again. This time a woman stepped in with her son, maybe 6 or 7, bright-eyed and bouncing. The moment they crossed the threshold, the boy froze. He pointed toward the booth. "Mom, that's him. That's the guy from the video." His voice echoed too loud in the small room. The woman hushed him, pulled him close, embarrassed. Arnold didn't turn, didn't react, just lifted his cup, sipped. The mother guided her son to a table near the front. The boy kept looking back. Camila watched it all unfold with something like disbelief. Her face had been in that video too. Her name now sat in comment sections, headlines, hashtags, but it wasn't the strength of her fists they talked about. It was the way she stood her ground, the way she didn't flinch. A man in line asked the cook, "What's his name?" The cook shrugged. "He doesn't say." Another whispered, "He's got to be former something, military, CIA, governor, I don't know." Arnold never corrected them, never claimed anything. When someone asked him directly, "Sir, what do we call you?" he looked up, held their gaze a moment, then shook his head once. That was all. The answer wasn't important. Camila stood behind the counter, towel in hand, heart a little fuller than it had been in weeks. She looked at him, not like he was a savior, but like he was a reminder, not of what saved her, but of what woke up in her when no one else was coming. The story had gone viral, but the moment that mattered most hadn't been recorded. It was the moment she chose not to back down. And in that quiet, shared space between memory and meaning, the town began to shift, one person at a time. The morning sun broke clean across the highway, burning off the last of the storm's breath. Steam lifted from the wet pavement. The sky, once bruised and heavy, had turned a soft, stubborn blue. Inside the Desert Moon diner, something had shifted. Not just the furniture, though the broken booth had been patched, the glass replaced, the jukebox unplugged and set gently against the wall like an old soldier finally allowed to rest. It was something else. The air didn't tremble anymore. The walls didn't lean inward with worry. Camila stood behind the counter, shoulders square, towel slung over one arm, apron snug around her waist. She didn't look at the door when it opened. Not anymore. She moved with intention. Not speed, not fear, just control, like someone who'd learned how to take up space again. Arnold sat at his usual booth, the last sip of tea resting cold in the bottom of his cup. He watched the morning play out like it was a film he'd already seen. Quiet conversations, clinking plates, the rhythm of normal life slowly reclaiming its place. Camila walked over with a fresh pot of coffee. She refilled his cup without asking. He gave a small nod. She stayed standing. "You leaving soon?" she asked. He glanced out the window. The light was full now, no clouds in sight. "Yeah, back on the road. Always." She hesitated, her voice dropped slightly. "What if they come back?" Arnold didn't answer right away. He looked at her not with concern, but with something steadier, like he was checking for something beneath the question. Then he said, "If you're still standing when I'm gone, they won't walk through that door again." She absorbed that. Let it settle into her ribs. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he said, "but it is true." He reached into his coat pocket and placed a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover the tea, the refills, and maybe a week's worth of quiet. Then he stood, tall and solid, like a part of the mountain stepping away. Camila followed him toward the door. The diner kept humming behind them. A fry cook yelled something in the back. A spoon hit the floor. No one flinched. Not even her. "You think I can really hold this place down?" she asked, softer now. He turned, looked at her square. "You already are." "I still get scared," she admitted. "So do I," he said, "every time. But when fear knocks, let courage answer the door." She smiled, just a little, just enough. "You always talk like that, only when it matters." The sun lit the doorway behind him. He stepped through it, paused with one hand on the frame. She almost asked, "Will I see you again?" But she didn't need to. He glanced back just once. "You won't need me," he said, and then he walked into the light. No goodbye, no big exit. Just a figure fading into the road, boots quiet against the pavement, shoulders wide enough to carry silence with him. Camila stood there a moment longer, then turned, not with hesitation, with purpose. The door clicked shut behind her. The morning crowd had grown, booths filled, orders called. The smell of bacon and hope floated in the air, the jukebox still dead, the room still scarred, but the fear gone. A woman approached the counter. "Are you the one from the video?" Camila smiled. Yeah, I guess I am. Can I sit? Anywhere you like. Camila poured another cup, wiped the counter, moved to the next customer. No rush, no flinch, no shadows in her steps. Outside, the sky stretched wide. Inside, the desert moon was healing, not because someone fought the fight for it, but because someone stayed after the fight and kept standing. And now, when people told the story, they didn't just talk about the man in the coat. They talked about the woman who faced fear and didn't look away, the one who stayed, the one who made them believe they could, too. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.